This month, we have the pleasure of listening to Sarah Ratay from Nature Conservancy about her work in the Sycan Reserve. This is Rachel's bio, or Sarah's bio. It's sounds really awesome. You can read it in the talk description. I think mostly I'm looking forward to hearing about her work in the Sycan Preserve through the Nature Conservancy, and any insights to her work leading up to her current position in the plant world. And that was something that we discussed being of interest for this month's presentation. Real quick, next month's speaker, sorry, my computer's not switching slides very quickly before I turn it over to Sarah. Okay, one speaker is, our speakers are Dr. Pepper Trail and Lance Wyss, who are going to be giving a joint talk about large wood. Each of them has an area of expertise. Dr. Pepper Trail specializes in cavity nesting birds, and Lance Wyss, who works for the Rogue River Watershed Council, will be talking about in-stream wood and their impacts on native plants. We're hoping to have kind of a dialogue type of presentation where they're trading back and forth and discussing more broadly the impacts of both larger native plant material in streams and in upland terrestrial habitat, and their impacts subsequently on native plants. So without further ado, I'm going to turn my screen over to Sarah. Thank you so much for joining us. We look forward to hearing.
Thanks, everyone. Okay, okay, great. Now I can share my screen. 1 second. Does it look good, Vanessa?
Yeah, we're seeing just your presentation screen.
Great, thanks. Well, so I agreed to do the talk, and I was like, oh yeah, January, I'll have plenty of time in January. And then I did, I was a little worried a month ago when I had 4 feet of snow that I was dealing with on the preserve, trying to keep the roads open and keep the equipment operating. I was a little worried, but I got a chance to pull together a lot of plant pictures for y'all, at least. So that's what I can promise to you. And I'm really excited to speak with everyone tonight and share about this preserve that I love so much. Okay, it's going to take me a second to shoot. Advanced. It was working so smoothly when we tried it. Okay, so Sycan Marsh Preserve is 30,000 acres, more or less. And you can see, can you guys see my cursor? Scroll over.
Yes, I can. Yes, we can.
Thanks for the feedback. Yeah, so it's in the sort of, I say, south central part of Oregon here. We're right on the border between Klamath and Lake County, so we include some of both in the preserve. So pretty much due east from y'all. And you can see the outline of the preserve in green in this larger map. And then here on the right, you see some representation of the different types of plant communities there. So the forest sort of is on the outside edge of the preserve. And you can see we have some, mainly it's a marshy area that various levels of wetland, but depending on the year. So we've had quite a dry run recently. So areas that look really marshy on this map are actually quite dry. But it's really fun to go see and be surprised by where there's water at different times of the year too. So Sycan Marsh Preserve was created in 1980 with the land purchase of a ranch. The area had been inhabited and managed by, people from the Klamath tribes, and we still try to involve them quite a bit in decision making, and hopefully we'll get even better at doing that, because we want to be good stewards of the land, sort of trying to have some continuity with the past and hopefully the future, if we can hand over the land when it's appropriate. I think the Nature Conservancy would be really, really pleased. The preserve was created in, for these, especially for the targets of managing endemic and rare aquatic invertebrates, endangered fish species, and migrating waterfowl. And also there's some really special plant communities on the preserve. So I can talk more about that. Some of the botanical features of the preserve. So there's roughly 400 native plant taxa on the species list. It's about 2/3 native, but there's very low cover of introduced plant species, around 90% native plant cover, because similar to other high elevation sites, plants don't invade quite as well when it's such a intense place to live, with the snow, and then we can get up to about 95 or 100 degrees in the middle of summer. So it's a little more challenging for introduced plants. And one of the conservation targets that we pointed out when creating the preserve was that we have the best remaining example of a tufted hairgrass meadow community in Oregon. And this book on the right, I don't know if some folks are familiar with it. So I used this book for 10 years, and before I moved to Sycan, and then I'd been there for a little while, and then I realized we're on the cover of Measuring and Monitoring Plant Populations. So the background picture is a wildflower meadow from Sycan Marsh Preserve, and the inset with the two people is also from the preserve. So I was like, whoa, we're plant famous. This is awesome. So it's just a more, as promised, plant pictures. So just of my favorite plants from the area, different things we found at different seasons. It's been just so fun so I've lived on the preserve for 3.5 years now. So you can go back to the areas and find some of these species every year in the same place and see how they vary from year to year, and enjoy that. There's a picture of the grassland below. It's kind of neat. So you can actually see a tufted hairgrass in the, so I'm not sure which screen has, but the kind of the tallest grass there is a tufted hairgrass. And it's just fun to appreciate these landscape scale of intact habitat, mostly doing what it's supposed to be doing and had been doing for such a long time before. And so also my very important coworker, Bonnie, is providing the backdrop for this flower picture. You'll see a lot of pictures of her. She's wonderful and she loves plants. So another interesting conservation benefit of Sycan Marsh Preserve is that we have provided a site for outplanting of Oregon semaphore grass. I don't know if people are familiar with the rarest grass in Oregon, but I'm a big fan of grasses. And so this is a picture from, I think, 2 years ago at one of the outplanting sites. So they're hanging on there. I'll show you on the map are the two native populations of this grass. So that's the total world distribution of that grass. It's two fairly tight areas with a few populations therein. And then our site is another site where the plant has been planted, so that it's both we're testing restoration techniques and just providing another seed source, another site in case something happens to those two only populations in the world. That's also just a beautiful grass. It's like just hanging in the breeze. So some of the challenges to vegetation conservation at Sycan Marsh Preserve. So especially in the last few years, drought has been has really changed the character of vegetation and distribution on the preserve. We do have cattle grazing. This last year was the last year of cattle grazing on the preserve. And so I'm looking forward to seeing the recovery. So the grazing lease was a 40-year grazing lease that has ended. So it should be a really interesting time. It should be a really great spring to come check out Sycan Marsh Preserve, because there won't be cattle grazing this year again. There are some invasive plant species, and I do spend a fair amount of time treating them and keeping things limited so that things don't spread. And then, so altered fire regimes and intensity of fire, as we'll talk more about, can be a real threat. So this picture roughly summarizes what it looks like right now. I actually had to leave because we have satellite internet, so it wouldn't be sufficient for doing a presentation. So I'm at a friend's place, but yeah, we have about 1.5 feet of snow on the ground now, so a little more like the right picture than the left picture. But winter can be fairly challenging when you're operating an off-grid field station. So we're all solar powered with a backup generator, but try to use that as little as possible at a mile high. It's about 2 hours to a grocery store. So, and that's without snow on the ground. So it's challenging and fun, and I can, just go cross country skiing out my front door sometimes, but I also have to be very safety conscious when living and working out there by myself through the winter. And I snowplowed the roads for the last 8 miles in. So, and in pre-COVID days, we hosted large events, and we will again in the future, including a large fish conference with 90 people in this field station. So it's 4,000 square feet, pretty big site. So inside, we often, I believe this day we had, this was one day we weren't able to do prescribed fire because of the weather conditions. So we looked at this researcher from the Montana Fire Lab, his models of the prescribed fire we were planning to do the next day. And so they actually, we have fire researchers that come out and actually model expected fire behavior, and then they're able to monitor with drones as we light fire on the ground and see if the fire itself does what's predicted in the model, if they got all their parameters right. So it's really amazing in the moment ground truthing of models. And they're looking at smoke effects on human firefighters, and it's really fun to be able to contribute to this. And also, it's just a great group of people, and running a caterer and all of the power demands on an off-grid system is definitely challenging, but it's kind of a fun challenge. So, and the field station was built in '97, so everything was top of the line for off-grid at that time. But I have to do things exactly right to get everything to work. So this is a group of firefighters, some volunteers with the proper training, and researchers that was implementing fire on this particular day. And the ponderosa pine forest in this area, the estimated historic fire interval was somewhere from 10 to 15 years. And so prescribed fire is, we want to be able to try to get to where we can duplicate a more natural fire regime to have the frequency close to historic levels. And it takes some work, especially in places where there hasn't been fire for a long time, what they call first entry fire, where you come into a place that has quite a bit of fuel. You need a really good burn boss to be able to do it with finesse and not overdo it. There's also some wildlife. Some people get excited about wildlife. I'm a plant person, so this is the only wildlife slide. No, it's actually a really fascinating place. We have a lot of really interesting birds. And so this wolf with its 2 coyote friends were hunting birds along the shore of a lake, the Thompson Reservoir, which is just nearby. So there's quite a bit of wolf use in the landscape, and I just saw tracks where I was driving a week ago. So they're definitely using our landscape, which is, I consider a compliment. And there's elk. All right, moving on, back to plants. So I'm gonna just briefly go through some of the plant communities on the preserve, just to give you some idea of what I find interesting, what we can talk about. So you see sometimes there's going to be a lot of maps, because I also love maps. You can see the outline of the preserve on the right, and then it's broken down into the plant communities. And this is work that was done in the 90s. We don't have enough staff to do a bunch of this kind of stuff nowadays, but it's really great that so much work got done in those years. So you can see there's wet and then wet dry prairie, there's wet meadow, the Tule Marsh, I guess, I'm not sure you guys can see my cursor, but I'll go through it. So the sage scrublands are in pink. So they're in the east side of the preserve, kind of on the perimeter, but there's also some really interesting pockets and a very dry habitat in the middle of very wet habitat. So I think it's pretty fun to see that on the landscape. So there's wet, dry meadows. We have aspen groves, especially in the middle of the marsh and some of the edges of the forest. Ponderosa pine woodlands, like I talked about, are mainly on the perimeter of the preserve and sort of contiguous with the Forest Service land that surrounds us. And then this huge wetland complex that you can easily see from Google Maps or probably from space is the Tule Marsh. And so that's a very wet area. I'll talk more about all those. So in this sage scrubland, there's some really lovely plants. And I really love this area. It's the first to flower in the spring. It's very shallow soils, exposed bedrock. And so it'll have runoff first, because there's not a lot of penetration in the soil. And so you get some interesting patterns there, and then it'll melt first. And so even in April, some of these plant species are out being their gorgeous selves. And I find it really cool. You go to each different patch of sage scrubland, or they do call it scabland here too, which I don't think is a very nice name, but and you go to each patch and there's sort of just a slightly different plant association in each one. This one's got the shooting star and this one doesn't, but it has the Hesperchiron and stuff. And so I really enjoy going around and getting to know those areas. There's another picture of some other plants that are there. And actually, like this Balsama rhiza, I haven't actually fit that to a species yet. It doesn't mean that it's not something that's known, but both of these species, I haven't had enough time to key them out to anything, and they don't easily fit with anything else. And you always wonder, because it's such an under botanized area. And I'd really love it if interested people would come out and just collect plants or do iNaturalist observations and try to get some more information. So we can talk more about that. If you see the exposed rock in the background behind the penstemon, that's a good example of the type of habitat. And so it's really interesting. There's soil crusts and lichen and moss communities that are just sort of mixed into this very interesting shallow soil area. So there's also both wet and dry meadows. These are a couple examples. And I think the bulk of the acreage on Sycan falls into this category, and some of it is grazed. And we do focus grazing into areas that can be more resistant to grazing. Historically now we won't be grazing cattle. And all of it supports amazing invertebrate and bird diversity. And I would love to just catalog biodiversity all day, every day. That would make me deeply happy. It's not something I have a lot of time for, because there's a million other important things to do. But just entering records on iNaturalist is, at least something we're, making documentation for other people to be able to look at what we have. So I love to share. So this is an example of a dry meadow. And this particular site was burned 2 years previous to this. And then I think it was maybe 5 years before that. And just, can be really lovely and really interesting to see the patterns in the landscape with more frequent fire that's more similar to the historic regime. There's also a wonderful fen on the preserve. This is a picture from it, and it's just a really delightful spot. I'm going to show you the next slide because it's got a map. So this is basically the layout of the fen. It's all been mapped very carefully. I think this publication is from 2005, and like here's an example of it on from Google Earth. You can see the fen is this small little feature right here next to the Tule Marsh, but it's fascinating. So it's 162 acres. It has 177 donut springs. So I'll show you that in a moment, but basically just groundwater that's coming out at pressure and actually lifts so the vegetation starts to mound up around the springs. Okay, I'm going to flip ahead and then I'll come back. Sorry. So this is, if you see in the foreground of this picture, there's a donut spring here. And so the vegetation is matted up above the marsh surface by a few feet, just from the piling up vegetation and that the groundwater is coming out at such a high pressure. And if so I don't know if everyone knows what a fen is, but it's a wetland that's fed by groundwater. A bog is fed by rainfall. So to distinguish the two. And like an example plant that I like to find in the fen here is this bog bean. It's pretty interesting range if you look at it. It sort of points out to me that Sycan Marsh Preserve, which I need to show you which dot is us probably. I've got a bunch of Zoom stuff on top of it, but we're in basically the south central part of Oregon there, where that dot that's sort of out east of everything else. And so it's a sort of an eastern extension of the Cascades and just a interesting wetland plant that makes it out that far east, but nowhere else except for in the extreme northeast part of the state. So, awesome donut spring. And this is the Forest Service botany team from 2 years ago. They were checking out our fen because it's pretty cool. Here's a few plant species that live in the fen. I really enjoy having carnivorous plants, and we have a fair amount of mosquitoes, so I like to just catch mosquitoes and try to feed it to the sundews to entertain kids if they come out and see. We also have some really lovely aspen groves, both in the center of the marsh and on the forest perimeters. And there's some controversy about this. It depends who you talk to, but like a good hot fire is supposed to stimulate reproduction in aspen groves. And we definitely want to encourage the aspen that we have to regenerate and help them spread and resist encroachment by lodgepole pine, which we've got quite a bit of that spreading into areas that weren't historically a pine woodland. We also have ponderosa pine woodlands. Those are, the outer perimeter of the preserve. And they can be really lovely. And this is a site that we've burned once a decade, twice already. So it's pretty interesting. And I just love the transition of a very, sort of dry looking habitat into these very wetlands, and sort of thinking about how different animals and invertebrates move between the landscapes. There's a very tiny ruffed grouse. See, I have a bird in the distance here. So this is right after a prescribed fire. I got pulled off because I had to go and I had a chimney sweep coming that I had to meet with. And so I'm walking back and there's just already a ruffed grouse. It was doing fine, wasn't harmed by the fire, and was like moving to a safer habitat. So I was kind of happy to see that. And I'm a sucker for monkey flowers. So in the sort of northeast corner of the preserves, that large two-way wetland. I'll show you a picture in a second. And this is a place that I've just explored once. So the day that I took this picture, we took the canoe out, and otherwise it's just this huge, maybe 10-foot of water depth for this very large area, as you'll see on the preserve. And so it's just fun to have places on the preserve you can't even go to very easily. But there was a beaver den in the middle of it with no trees around, and really, really interesting. So you can kind of see this picture on the left is from the top of Sycan Butte looking out to the marsh. And so that's the Thule wetlands, all that water you can see in the bottom. It's huge. It's just fun working on a landscape scale like this, and trying to see parts of the preserve I've never been to. So how was 2021 for Sycan Marsh Preserve? This is a GIF I put together from game can footage that I put out the game can to try to get some interesting wildlife action, but I got a cattle incursion where they weren't supposed to be, and a grasshopper plague. It was a pretty wild year already. We lost a lot of biomass was consumed on the preserve this year. I think it would be really interesting to be able to quantify that, because there were a lot of cows and grasshoppers out there. And then the Bootleg fire started just off our southern boundary. It was about 15 miles when it started from the south edge of the preserve. It started on July 6th. We'd actually already had a wildfire on the preserve that year. So Memorial Day weekend, last year, Memorial Day weekend, we also had a wildfire that made it onto the preserve. And then this one started. And I'm sure everybody's heard of the Bootleg fire, and we talked about it a little bit. It was unprecedented in terms of like size and speed for this area. It moved about, and sometimes up to 5 miles a day through these forests. It's definitely an exciting year. And this is a picture of it right before it burned onto the preserve. That's an aspen grove, and just some really extreme fire behavior stuff that people that had spent their whole career doing fire were really surprised by. And we had super dry fuel moistures, and I'll show you the final polygon of the fire. So it ended up burning 413,000 acres. At the time, it was the largest fire in the US. You can see that on the edges of the map, those forested sections on the south and west sides of the preserve, those areas were burned into, the fire started to go out as it burned into the wetter parts in the middle of the marsh. So you can kind of see the red fire perimeter on the right gets very broken and kind of starts to wander a bit in those wetter areas. So I think it's really interesting. The marsh sort of stopped. And I think that Thule area up in the north, that there's no way the fire would have moved through that. So it was pretty interesting. And also the fire came up against, I'll go back, came up against some of the areas that we've been doing prescribed fire in. So the last about 10 years, been trying to put as much prescribed fire on the ground as we safely can. And so there's areas here on the west line of the preserve and up in the north where we saw some very different fire behavior when this huge hot megafire burned into areas that had been previously burned. I think I've got some other slides about that, but I wanted to show you. So this is a map of vegetation mortality. So there's vegetation and soil severity that get looked at after a fire. And so you'll see that there's almost, most of the area is red, indicating complete replacement of the trees that were there before. And so above ground vegetation was almost completely lost throughout. And there's some really interesting little channels of blue. And, so the blue in the middle is definitely our wetter areas that it was not able to spread into. And then there's some other streams and areas that the fire wasn't able to move through, but a lot of vegetation loss. But soil severity, at least, was not as intense. It wasn't high in many of the areas. It was just a few localized areas where it was extremely high. And the soil burn severity is a more helpful predictor of how challenging long-term recovery will be for these areas. So when soil gets heated extremely hot and loses all its organic material, it starts to lose its structure, and it's not able to form the same functions as it did in the past. So generally, we're looking for good news in a big mega fire here. At least this is some good news that overall the soil impacts were at least somewhat more moderate than the vegetation impacts. And I don't know if everyone knows, but so we've had quite a bit of media interest in the patterns that we saw in the landscape. So Sycan Marsh Preserve has been trying hard to lead and share information about how to do prescribed fire on the landscape. And we work closely with our Forest Service partners at the Fremont-Wainema National Forest. And so when our prescribed areas that we had burned with prescribed area actually slowed this mega fire down, people have been very interested in that story because it's a little hard to find good examples of that. And I think the more examples of the right way to manage a forest, the better. So we had quite a bit of interest from media, New York Times, and other articles being written about the preserve, which is great because we're trying to share the best science we can. We're trying to just help our forests become more resilient into the future because climate change is a severe challenge for Oregon's forests and the country's. And we've done some post-fire monitoring. We got some monitoring done this fall, even with the tight turnaround and restoration. And I'll be working on repairing a lot of fences. So that's another big part of my job is working on fence lines. This is an area that got burned through. So we'll see what the fence conditions are like. We try to replace older wooden posts with metal posts. They'd be more resistant to prescribed fire anyway. So we should have some sections that are still intact. But sometimes I have to hike in a wetland in waders with the chainsaw chaps. But fortunately, my dog Bonnie helps by carrying fence supplies in her little backpack. And I really like this picture because she's smiling like a crazy dog. She's got this hilarious look on her face. And it's fun to have her help. So the recovery efforts are ongoing. We're trying to share information, trying to demonstrate everything we can on the ground. We want to, we're hoping to plan a conference for people doing fire ecology. We just want to share as much information as we can with the patterns that we've seen with this fire. The marsh areas, I just want to assure you, are used to even more frequent fire than the forest, and they will recover quickly. It's a really wonderfully resilient site. I like to say just, if you can remove the invasive species and if you can just let places recover naturally that have such a high cover of natives and have the seed bank existent, they'll come back really well. So I'm excited about seeing what the spring's going to be like. the wrong direction. So yeah, that's what I got. Another plant picture to finish it out. Let me know if you have any questions. We're always looking for volunteers. It's difficult with COVID. It's a little hard to encourage people to come volunteer when we're not quite sure what things are going to be like, but my email's there at the bottom. Let me know. I can put you in contact with our volunteer department if you're interested in that. I'd love to host some field trips. We were planning them for 2019 because it was the 40th anniversary of the preserve, and even a bio blitz, which I think would be really helpful. So hopefully we can do that soon. It's just a little hard to plan on anything, but thanks for listening and everyone's interest.
Thank you, Sarah.
Yeah.
I love a super loaded plant picture presentation. Always.
Oh, I forgot one thing. Do people want to see a drone video from the middle of the marsh when it was very wet?
Yes.
Okay, cool. I'm going to stop.
Guarantee.
I'm going to pull that up. You can look, like, give me a question or two while I'm doing that if you want.
Maybe a fun question for you to answer while you're pulling that up is from Rachel, who is asking when we should all come visit. When is the best time to come visit? And maybe she means as like a plant person, which given your description of the bloom times in response to different hydric regimes, it could be a long season, or I don't know. What do you think about that?
Oh, that's a hard question. Best time? I mean, I think you got to visit several times, right?
Yeah.
No, I'll see my changes. Sorry.
Well, I was thinking you've had the fire and maybe some of the marsh burned, like what would be, if you don't live there and you can't be there all the time and you can just peel out a few days, like when would be the first best time to come? Yeah,
for sure. So May and June are the best months there. Because it's so high elevation, it can definitely still snow in June. You'd be surprised. And yeah, absolutely. It's May and June is when it's plantastic out there. A little earlier in the year is when it's birdtastic. It gets a little bird infested. Frankly, they wake me up, the cranes. It's like, oh. No, I'm not actually complaining. They're lovely. Yeah, so early spring is really great. Fall can be, it depends on the year, can be pretty dry. There's a lot of mosquitoes in spring. It's hard to say, but I hope people can come several times. We will have plenty of work to do and plenty of flowers to look at. Okay.
On the topic of visiting and work to do, I'm curious if you want to circle back to the iNaturalist comment or play your video if it's ready. Do you?
Yeah. So iNaturalist. Yeah. So, okay. So the preserve is not open to the public, which I think people can understand. There's a real challenge with visitation to preserves, and especially this remote preserve. I mean, it's 30,000 acres. I can't patrol it. So people do need to come out in, either an official form, so volunteering or some other way to, so that we kind of know what's happening on the preserve and stuff. So, sorry, Vanessa, what was your question? Like how to volunteer
or like ways that iNaturalist might be useful?
Oh yeah, totally. So the best thing in the world are plant collections, right? But you can't always take plant collections. Not everybody has the expertise to collect plants and do press plant specimens and place them in an herbarium and get them expert vouchered. So iNaturalist is a wonderful way to catalog the diversity that you see in the field, even non-plants. I know, boring, but still interesting. I'm actually really trying to get really good butterfly coverage because it's something we don't have a good catalog of. But it's just a great way. So take really as good of pictures as you can, maybe some, a habitat photo and a close up, and but try to capture the organism that you see that you're interested in and share it on iNaturalist. Experts will identify it for you. It's amazing. And you can contribute to science by sharing things on iNaturalist because then those records get seen by the experts in the groups, and they, maybe you find something cool like a range extension or something fascinating. So biodiversity is so cool, and it's great to help. Okay, let me share this before I forget. Oh, hold on. So just like picture yourself as as just a bird experiencing the landscape. It's a drone. It's not as good as a bird, but that's, And I actually, so we were testing out a theory that we could fly the fence lines to see how intact they were via drone. But also we just got a cool view of the landscape in the middle of the marsh where it's very wet. And unfortunately, the trailing that you see is from cattle, but I'm sure some of them are elk trails, and there's some birds. So hopefully it will be exciting to some people. Everybody seeing this okay? I'm not good enough that I can identify graminoids at this scale, but I'm not seeing any of our invasive plant species in this area. So you can see the fence line distinction there. It gets more exciting, I promise. I mean, not that much more exciting, but there's an aspen grove, and yeah, so you can see just popping up at the top of the screen. I'm really intrigued by these aspen groves that seem to be just in, it's a slightly drier area that they can establish and spread, but there's definitely not, not conifer encroachment or other issues there. I scared some elk out of this particular aspen grove last time I was there. All right, we can move on to questions. I think you guys got the idea. It's big. It's a big place.
That is a lot of water.
Yeah, that was not this year, 2 years ago.
To your aspen note, I'm going to just skip to Rachel. Rachel asked if the aspens burned in the bootleg fire.
Many of the groves did. Yeah, absolutely. There's some in the middle of the marsh that are surrounded by water that didn't. Most of them did. And they're regenerating already, but I don't have a great, so it's challenging, right? So we just have a forest of dead trees now. So it's a little hard to safely work in some of those areas and access some of those areas. We've got a lot of trees falling across roads and closing things. So it's definitely challenging as well. So I haven't been to all the aspen groves, but the ones that are close to the field station that I live at are doing well.
Cool. Rachel also in that question asked what Sycan refers to, maybe the word.
Yeah, I don't get this wrong, but my understanding is that it was a gathering place for tribal members historically. And so it was a place where people would, it was like a grassy, I got that wrong. So it's like a grassy plain. So really like from Google Maps or some other way of looking, you sort of scan across the Eastern Cascades, and there's just this large grassy marsh on the landscape. And so the name is something like the grassy place, I believe. I hope I didn't say that wrong.
Cool. Christy is mentioning that SLC had a conservation easement in Lake County that was a site for the beautiful Oregon semaphore grass outplanting a number of years ago. I think it seems like it was a private parcel that had maybe that species on it, and it was unsuccessful due to drought. How big is the outplanting population at the Sycan Marsh? Glad to know about it.
Yeah, so it was planted before I started working there, I've monitored it. There's a southern population that's only had a couple of clumps that are still alive. I think there was maybe like 10 clumps planted originally. And then the northern population, about 5 clumps are still remaining. So not great success, but the wettest spots are doing the best. Totally inundated, like topping your rubber boots kind of inundation. So that seems to be what it loves. And I didn't get to monitor it this year because we always do it in August, and August was when I was evacuated for the fire. But I have a feeling they didn't have a great year, so hopefully they hung on.
Yeah, the drought and yeah. I was curious if you all monitor the impacts on fire on your, like the forb classes of non-natives or just in general.
Sorry, you said forb classes or four?
Just like forbs, like
Yeah.
do you monitor fire impacts on your forbs and we
have a lot of thistle species that are encouraged by fire. Like that's one of our main invasive problems. And even post prescribed fire, that's the thing that we do is like, spend extra time treating thistles because we know that will happen post fire. And so I'm going to have a lot of thistles to work on in the bootleg perimeter, I believe. But I'm trying to think of other forbs that would be interesting. We don't have a lot of forbs, native or non.
Oh, great. There's a lot of folks expressing their gratitude. And then I think Christy is asking again if there are any 2022 work parties nearby camping areas. And she also posted a how to get involved link for Sycan Marsh.
Thank
Christy,
you,
you're
Christy.
on it. You're on it.
That's perfect. Yeah, I had it in the slide, but I couldn't like paste it. I hope that we can plan work parties. It's just tough to plan stuff right now. We want to keep everybody safe. There is nearby camping. So Thompson Reservoir has several camping sites on both sides of the reservoir. So if you just look in, that's Forest Service land. Yeah, I mean, everybody send me emails. I get a little bored out there in the woods by myself. So if you have questions about good camping, anything like that, I will try to get back to you promptly. And it's a fun place to share.
Well, and our last question is whether or not you use electric or gas chainsaws in the fence work, which sounds so brutal. A 30,000 acre preserve.
So that was a gas chainsaw. I think this weekend I'm going to buy an electric chainsaw. So I use chainsaws quite a bit for fence, but I also driving in and out of the preserve. So I have to plow the road, and then also trees fall across the road. So I don't like carrying the gas chainsaw in my truck. So I'm going to buy an electric chainsaw this weekend, a battery operated one. And I'm very excited about it because it will be great for fence work. And I have done fence work from my bike with just like bike bags. And that's going to be a lot lighter to be able to carry into areas. For some, the bike is the right tool over an ATV because it's more nimble. You can get it over down trees and stuff.
Awesome. Paul Slichter is also posting a link for that may help with exploring the botany around the edges of Sycan Marsh. It's a Fremont Wainema page, it looks like, for the National Forest. So thank you.
They have some very cool plants.
Great. Awesome. Yeah, it sounds like if the preserve isn't open to the public and people want to be botanizing in the area, maybe some adjacent public land is a safe bet.
Absolutely, but ask me for tips.
Okay. Before you leave service, email Sarah.
Yes, yeah, a few days ahead.
Yeah, great. I think Rachel says she loves Thompson Res area, super birdtastic. If you like birds too, these things tend to go hand in hand. There's just a lot of great comments about people being excited about this preserve. Thank you so much for telling us about this place. I've always wanted to know more about Sycan. Teresa's asking, oh, never mind. Sorry. Sorry.
Thanks, everyone.
If you want to put your email in the chat, Sarah,
Oh, sure. I'll do that.
people to do any follow-up questions with, because this is being recorded, I think the chat also gets saved in some capacity in case you want to look at it later, Sarah, and chat with people. So thank you again. Yeah.
And I got to give a shout out to Susan Harrison, who mentored me when I was an undergrad at Davis back in the 90s and was on this call. Good job, Susan.
Susan said good job to you. So yeah. Yeah. Big fan, Susan. Just saying, a couple of fans over here. Our last, our speakers 2 months ago recommended some of Susan's work and talking about the cascade gap between sort of the Shasta Trinity area and describing or work that could, sort of lend itself towards understanding remnant populations versus new expansions. And that was great. Julie, that's that person, sorry. So again, okay, thank you. Thank you so much, everyone who's joined us. Please add any final questions. It's 8 o'clock on the dot. This is a very timely meeting this month. Yeah. Okay. I think we're gonna wrap up. Thank you, everyone, for joining us.